Okay, hi everyone. You're very welcome to this seminar, and I am very glad to have been invited to speak to you today about artificial intelligence and responsible innovation. So my name is Stephen Hughes, and I work at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL. Science and Technology Studies is pretty much the social study of science, and it involves philosophy, history, and sociology. And my particular area of interest is in responsible innovation, which is pretty much like science ethics or thinking about the politics of science. And I'll go into it a little bit in detail later on as I go through this talk. So you're all, as I said, very welcome. I'm glad that you are here. I'm hoping to keep this brief enough and not to waffle on for too long. But there's three main things that I want to cover in this talk. The first one is, coming back to the title there, How to Care for Your Robot, is, why are we talking about care? It seems like a really strange word to be using to talk about artificial intelligence, which is a technology. It's something which is a product of mathematics, science, engineering. How can we talk about care? So I'm going to this is going to be a little bit of a philosophical talk. So I'm going to think about the philosophical roots of this idea of care and think about the philosophical roots of science itself and knowledge and different ways that we can approach this idea of knowledge and how the idea of care might be useful in how we think about knowledge. And then I'm going to talk about responsible innovation, give you more of an explanation as to what responsible innovation is and how the idea of care is used here, how we find it useful. And then finally, I'm going to talk about AI itself, machine learning, and how we can, again, use this idea of care in this space. So this is going to be a fairly sort of philosophical approach. I've worked with the CDT and foundational AI, and I got to learn a huge amount about what that group is doing, the kind of scientific work that they're doing. So I thought that this would be a nice opportunity for me to share from the social sciences and humanities side how we think about science and how we think about artificial intelligence. So I'm going to start off with the story of Frankenstein. So this story is frequently used as a kind of cautionary tale against science. It's something that we see time and time again in fiction, in horror, science fiction, fantasy. This idea of scientists who create something which then they lose control of, and that their striving for knowledge gets the better of them. And we see it in the story of Icarus, the story of Prometheus in Pandora's box, that scientists seek knowledge in some way, but the knowledge ends up being more powerful than they are. And that idea is kind of, we shouldn't be meddling where we don't belong. And that's kind of, the accepted story or the accepted moral at the heart of Frankenstein. But there's a philosopher, and his name is Bruno Latour. He's really famous in the field of science and technology studies and sociology of science. And he wrote an essay in 2012 which kind of challenges that idea. And he says, well, really that the central sin or crime at the heart of the story of Frankenstein is not that the scientist creates the monster. It's that he neglects the monster, that he fails to take care of the monster. And it's only in his kind of shooing away of the monster that it goes on to cause all of the havoc and the death and destruction. So Bruno Latour says that Dr. Frankenstein's crime was not that he invented a creature through some combination of hubris and high technology, but rather that he abandoned the creature to itself. And he sees that parallel being far more informative of how we think about science today. And he goes on to write that our sin is not that we created technologies, but that we fail to love and to care for them. We must care for our technologies as we do our children. So that's a very evocative, provocative kind of a phrase. And we're going to really drill down into that idea. How could we think about caring for, machine learning, data processing? How can we do this? So to start, I'm going to think about the idea of science, scientific knowledge in a far more broad sense. And the idea that I want to sort of introduce at the beginning is the idea that science, technology, engineering, mathematics, they happen in the world. So this is a really important distinction. Sometimes we can kind of trick ourselves into believing that through mathematical models, through our understanding of the cosmos, through our scientific theories, that in some way, we have drawn a circle around the entire universe, and within it is the whole world. Everything from the beginning of the Big Bang to today, that we can somehow understand everything either through mathematics or deductive reasoning, or some kind of circle that we can draw around it. But the reality of the situation is all of the mathematics, all of the science, all of the engineering that takes place happens here on the Earth. It happens in the world. It doesn't happen outside of it. And part of that is recognizing the idea that science and technology and engineering happens in a relational way. It involves relationships. It's not something that's separate from the world. It's not something that exists in a sort of abstract space. It's something that is here in the world. And the world has an impact on the kind of science and the scientific knowledge that's produced, whether that be the research priorities of research councils, of policymakers and governments, or big organizations like the European Union, whether that be the fact that we've limited resources. So we can't just learn and do all of the scientific experiments that we want. That we live in a world of finite resources, and there's only so much resources to go around. So we have to make decisions and choices about what we think is worth knowing, what we think is interesting, and when we feel that we've learned enough to move on. And it's also limited by the choices that certain powerful groups, institutions, or individuals make, and that can be decided by university ranking, by citation metrics, or all of these other things that we use to evaluate whether someone is a good scientist or whether an institution is producing excellent knowledge. And part of the shaping that happens of scientific knowledge, because it's happening in the world, happens because we're human. So humans aren't creating this kind of abstract and universal and total picture of the world. We're creating representations, and we create representations in ways that we mediate as humans. So we have particular senses. We are dominated by the sense of sight. So all of our representations tend to be visual, tend to relate to wavelengths of light, tend to be text-based. We also are heavily influenced by sound. So we use speech to parse and make sense of the world. And also, there are other issues about being human, parts of the human condition, which really shape the things that we find interesting, or the things that we find that we want to pursue or know about the world. So this is kind of getting to like the big cosmological questions now. The idea here is that knowledge plays a really, really important role in our lives. So we know the kind of, the standard idea that science improves our lives by, giving us an understanding of the world and allowing us to engineer technologies which extend our lifespan, increase agricultural production and industrial production. And so it's important for us in that way. But philosophers and psychologists and cultural theorists also look to the role that scientific knowledge plays in the meanings that we produce and the collective sense making that we make about who we are, about what our place is in the world, and those huge big questions like what is the meaning of life. And there's an argument that's frequently made in humanities and social sciences literature, which says that the Enlightenment really served to shift our faith as in Western civilization, faith from God as being the guarantor of truth to science and humans and people becoming the guarantors of truth. So we can now, scientists, can now make sense of the world, and truth is moved from, being the realm of the divine and of God, to humans. So we're now in control of our destinies, and we're now in control of the world. And something really important happens here. Like humans have always needed this sense of security that certainty and order bring. It's part and parcel of the human condition. Being human is difficult. Being human is painful, and it's frightening. We're aware of our own mortality. We're aware of the physical limits of our bodies. And quite frequently, we like to turn to fantasies about how we can transcend the limitations of our bodies, how we can transcend mortality, and how we can transcend the earthly plane that we live in. And scientific knowledge and mathematical reasoning is a way for us to believe that we can have something of that we can have this certainty, this universality, which appears to us in mathematical proofs, in when scientific experiments prove theories, that we feel that we've really cracked it. So it allows us to rationalize, make sense of, and order what is really a very complex, ambiguous, and uncertain world that we live in. It allows us to put a shape on things, and it gives us a sense of security. But what happens is then that we try to build a social world which mirrors that efficiency, which mirrors the certainty of the proofs, where everything has order and everything fits into its place. We might think of something like IQ. It gives us a sense that we can capture and understand what is very, very elusive, the idea of intelligence. The way that we allow the market to dominate political decision making and to dominate how societies are organized and structured. And what's happening here, the philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard said, he was a really well-known philosopher of postmodernism. What's happening here is that humanity is reduced to its assumed essence, which is thought. And we come back to that idea that mathematical reasoning or thought itself can give us access to this universal and abstract realm. And we come up with these ideas like people are fundamentally rational, and that we have access to reason, and that we can make right or wrong decisions about the world we live in. And this shapes everything from advertising to politics and voting to elections to if we think about now the COVID messages, that we assume that people are inherently rational, and that when they're giving information, they can just process it and come to the right conclusion. And if they don't, then there's something wrong with how they're reasoning, or there wasn't enough information given, or something like that. But there's a challenge here, because this idea of having thought without a body erases the material reality of the human experience and human condition. The fact that individual people are different, cultures are different, that our individual understanding of the world comes from relationships with other people, relationships with our own bodies, relationships with our past, and relationships with the physical material world which surrounds us. So now we're going to move on to the real issue here, where a kind of shift happens, where the philosopher Martin Heidegger talks about how at first science and technology and mathematics comes to us as a tool. It's something that we use to change our lot in the world, or to advance our position. But he argues that there came a point when our relationship to technology shifted, so that these technologies were no longer within our control. They began to control us. So something, again, moving back to this idea of mathematics, we move from applying mathematics to the world as an instrument or as a tool, to us becoming the tool of mathematics, because to us the entire world is understood through mathematical laws or through mathematical principles. And it comes back to a very, very simple kind of folk idea, where when that idea that when you're holding a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And in this scenario, the world starts to look like our scientific representations. We can see this as an image here of this book called Digital Physics, and this comes back to that idea that, there are many who believe that we can now understand the world through information processing, that we can calculate the universe through, a certain number of bits or bytes, and that it leads to what this guy here, Glatfelter, says is an amalgamation of information theory, black hole thermodynamics, and string theory, which hints at this really radical ontology. And ontology is basically what our theory of existence, our theory of what things exist. This is the belief that the universe is a hologram, and you might have heard this because it was in the news a while ago. So basically, in other words, the three-dimensional reality that we are accustomed to and relate to in our sort of everyday lives is actually an illusion created by some sort of mass of information content encoded on a two-dimensional area. And the conclusion then is that space and time appear to be emergent properties arising from some sort of pure quantum entanglement, and that this then becomes the true nature of reality, that the universe, in fact, following this train of logic, is actually simply a simulation. It's just a mass of data, of information. And that has, that's exactly like what I was talking about at the beginning, that idea that we come to sort of define the entire world and believe that we've captured everything, and it almost becomes like a game of trying to draw a bigger circle around everything and say, like, right, now I've drawn this conceptual circle, now I've understood everything and everything is within that. But even these theories, even this, book about the idea of digital physics, that physics is actually, can be understood through the paradigm of information, that's just happening in this world. And it comes back to that main point that I was saying, that, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it happens in the world. And that mistake that we make where we think that we've cracked it and we are now greater than the entire universe or all of reality, is actually a mistaken one. And it has real impacts on how we organize society. So here's an example from a policy document, which looks at the image on the left there, which looks at 3-year-old children, which looks at young people and neglect and these social issues like early intervention and benefits, failed relationships, abuse, violent crime. It sees these as brain optimization, that if you optimize brains, all of these social issues will go away. And this comes from this idea that, if we can understand everything through some sort of like data optimization, we will be able to solve social issues. So social and political issues become math and tech issues. If we can solve them through math and tech, then we'll be able to address these other issues. But again, it's neglecting the reality of the situation where, but we're living in this real world. Something like, climate change, again, poverty, crime, we feel, okay, there's tech solutions or there are, math solutions to these problems, when, there are also responses that we can make which exist in society by changing the material, real society which surrounds us. So like I say at the bottom there, there's no room for human being in a space of data being, and we begin to lose what it means to be human, that relational, embodied, visceral, everyday existence of what it means to be human moving through the world. And we tend to reduce it to these mathematical abstractions. So coming back to Bruno Latour, he basically says that, like, hold on a second, we really need to bring ourselves back down to earth, back down to terra firma, as he calls it, and remind ourselves that, there is a certain amount of hubris creeping in here, where we believe that every problem, every issue can be solved by some sort of, mathematical or engineering tech solution. And it's because we have this idea that, well, fundamentally the whole world is quantifiable. So surely if we just get the equations right or the sums right, we can solve the problem. But when we think about this idea that science is happening in the world, we need to remember that we're sharing this world. And we've seen with issues like climate change, with mass species extinction, with antimicrobial resistance, with COVID, that, you know, like, we are actually quite powerless in the face of, you know, this nature or this world, which is, you know, talking about digital physics or talking about, you know, singularities, which are, you know, like beyond most people's comprehension. Like, yeah, that's really huge, very stimulating, interesting stuff. But the stuff that's happening right back down here on the physical Earth, we're being completely defeated by it. You know, poverty, like starvation, you know, like violence, all of these issues that are happening here, we're struggling to address and comprehend because we're thinking about them in the quite limited sense of a sort of a scientific or mathematical type of reasoning. So Bruno Latour suggests that, again, we need to stop and think about our innovations and think about the things that we're creating. And rather than just leaving them be and letting them go out into the world, thinking about, you know, how can we take care of them? How can we take care of the people in the world around them after they've been produced? And this is where responsible innovation steps in, because this is really fundamentally about what this idea of responsible innovation is trying to do. So we could just move on to this idea of responsible innovation and thinking about how the term care is used here. So I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this idea, but it's a policy kind of term or phrase which has developed in the past 20 years or so. Very popular at the European Union level. There it's called responsible research and innovation. It's also been quite successful and effective in the UK with the research councils. The EPSRC has mandated that, like, all of its Centre for Doctoral Training students have to undergo some sort of training in research responsible innovation. And it's a little different from just research integrity or research ethics. And I'm going to go through those differences now. So its fundamental premise, I guess, is that, you know, science is hugely powerful. It has the capacity to completely change the future, to make futures, and that we really should consider what kind of future it is that we want to bring about, and who gets to say what futures are brought about, and, you know, how should we go about making them. So again, it's this idea of, rather than just seeing the future as inevitably tech or science based, and this is just the way things are going to go, it's about bringing that humility back and seeing it again as a tool, as something that we use to advance humankind and advance our experience in the world, not something which is outside of that experience. So in some of the ways that it's different from ethics is that it's not just about accountability, like, you know, pointing the finger and blaming people and saying, you know, oh, like, it's that company's fault, they, you know, allowed this pollution to happen. Because the problem with that is that it tends to address situations or problems after the fact. So, you know, after they've already happened. And as we've seen with the scale of some of the problems that we're facing now, you know, it is quite hard to put the genie back in the bottle once something like climate change or antimicrobial resistance has occurred. It becomes very, very difficult to retroactively address those situations. So it's not simply just about waiting until something bad has happened and then trying to do something about it. But it's also not about kind of consequentialism or, you know, abstract principles or rules that we sort of programmatically follow and say, you know, these are the 5 golden rules of responsibility, and, you know, we need to always follow these rules. It's more responsive. It's more continual and adaptable and flexible. And it centers around this idea of care as a sort of a lens or a frame or a way of kind of understanding why responsibility is valuable to us. So it avoids this idea of certainty that I've been talking about, the kind of, you know, universal order that we take comfort in mathematical reasoning. Responsibility is not an algorithm. It's not something that can be just plugged in and it'll just, we can just follow the manual and the responsibility will happen. It's something that's completely context dependent, and it prioritizes an ethics of wisdom over sort of, calculating rationality. It finds ethics in practical knowledge, in know-how, in experience, in like relational learning and learning from other people, in having been through things before. So it's something that's cultivated. It's something that's shared as a culture, less than a set of rules that you need to follow. So let's drill down a little bit more into this idea of care. So I'm just going to see what my time is. So fundamentally, care is about sort of bringing the human back into the way that we think about the world. Part of it is the intuitive sense of care that comes from thinking about caring for children and the responsibility that we have to care for children. It's just it's something that people can immediately kind of get a sense of. Being cared for as a child when you're vulnerable is a formative aspect of human experience, and it's one that we hope that all adults will have experienced. Care also, as a concept, sort of respects and also promotes or prioritizes the inherent unpredictability and diversity of people and of cultures. So the idea of care acknowledges that people are going to be different, that people are unpredictable, that we can never finally predict what it is that someone's going to be doing, because people are, completely dynamic. They're not located in, the outline of the body. They're located in their past experiences. They're located in the culture which surrounds them. They're located in their relationships with other people. So in some ways, it's kind of a mistake to assume that it's the individual which is doing the responsible stuff. It's something which is shared, and as a part of that, unpredictability and uncertainty and diversity is kind of embraced and is a part of that. But that difference, from a philosophical perspective, is really crucial, because it allows us to have agency, and agency is the ability to choose, to change things, to do things in another way. And this goes against the kind of sense of inevitability, which I hear a lot of the time when I speak to people about responsible innovation. It's like, people go, yeah, I guess what you're saying is true. Like, there are, problems with how, the market dictates what kind of tech we develop, but that's just the way it is, and it's the way it's always going to be. Thinking about care and the idea of difference and diversity gives us, it's like it kind of drives a little bit of a wedge in and gives us a little bit of space to think differently, and to even imagine that things could be otherwise. And this kind of really drills down to the sort of the heart of it. Care is about the not just the rational, although that's really important. It's also the fact that being ethical or being moral is also an emotional part of being humans. Without emotions, we wouldn't stop or wouldn't stop our reasoning. We wouldn't know where to stop, what was salient, what was meaningful, what we cared about, what things we were passionate to know about, things like awe and wonder, all of these types of things. That strong sense of justice or fairness. This is part of being humans in bodies that have emotional drives, as well as having reason, and emotions are responsible for creativity and imagination, the capacity to think outside the box, to think about new things, and to think about how we would like the world to be. So again, it's located in the lived world. It's back down here in the world. It's not something that's abstract and outside of everything. And in that way, it's constantly going with us as we progress through the world and as things change, and it kind of co-evolves with society. And like I say here, it matters that we are made of these wet organic bodies, that we have specific senses which dominate how we perceive the world. And responsible innovation fundamentally is about recognizing, that being human plays an important role in science, and we can really forget about this. We can be distracted by the kind of quantification of what excellent science is or what impact is, and thinking about university rankings or bibliometrics or impact factors, or all of the things that we value and find that we quantify excellence as. We forget that science is done by humans, and humans exist in institutions, and institutions are political, and we exist in societies. People have conflicts, people have preferences, people have desires, they have reputations and careers. There are already, it's well documented in my field. Emotions are already everywhere in science. It's what motivates you to get up in the morning. It motivates you to continue doing what you're doing. The joy, the sense of pleasure, the enrichment, the reward, the satisfaction, things like jealousy, all of the things that drive us, the things that make things worthwhile, the things which point out salience or intensity, these are all a product of being emotional beings. I really like this quote here about care from there's two scholars who've written about this in the field. They say that care is the way in which the world takes on significance for us. So, that things matter, that we really care about something, that we decide to pick out this thing that's worth looking at or worth investigating or studying. And it takes on significance in relation to the interpretation of our interests, what we want, what others want, and the future horizons that these interests shadow for us. So where do we want to go? What kind of future do we want to live in? And how do we want to get there? And it's an activity that unites our emotional, our imaginative, and our rational sides. And it comes back to that idea about caring for our monsters, because they're not actually monsters in this sense. They don't have to be monsters, because when we care about them, they're amazing instruments and amazing tools which allow us to do incredible and wonderful things. And I think that's really the kind of distinction that I'm trying to make here. Okay, so moving quickly on to care and artificial intelligence. So how can we think about all of this kind of wild philosophical stuff that I've been talking about? How can we think about that in relation to artificial intelligence? Well, actually, it's AI, and I know from working with the Foundation AI group that it's almost like a term that's not taken very seriously. It's like, talk about machine learning or data science or something, and that's fine. But artificial intelligence is more like this kind of just brand that's used to attract funding. But it exists, and it creates research. It creates research centers. This idea, there's something about that which draws in resources, which allows funding to be directed towards particular types of research, and scientific knowledge is then produced in this world as a result of that. And a part of it is it because it speaks to that fantasy of that what it means to be human can be reduced to some sort of abstract dimension of thought and loaded onto a hard drive and fired off into space when the sun eventually envelops the Earth. That sort of fantasy, that idea that we can completely and utterly transcend, in the same way that medieval people believed that, or many people still believe that we can transcend our bodies and go to heaven. There's a sense that if we can translate ourselves into our thoughts and our essence, into some sort of abstract form, that we'll be able to do that. And part of AI works with data, it works with information, and it's absolutely fundamentally about order and categories, and simplifying and making things fit into, it puts it into this bucket or that bucket, or this box or that box, and it tries to make sense and arrange what is like a completely complex, dynamic, and non-linear world, and yet still tries to be like, well, but how can we put a shape on this, and how can we find the patterns and the orders within that? Which is why it has problems when it runs into categorizing things like gender or race, fundamentally because these are not easily definable things. They're subjective, they change, they shift. There's an AI researcher who calls them like squishy. They're like squishy concepts that aren't, easily defined by their edges. And yes, like all meaning and all representation is, the language that we use is some form of simplification. But the difference with the argument that I'm making here is that with AI and more broadly with sort of mathematical scientific reasoning is that, we believe that that thing can actually can stand in for reality. We believe that, yeah, we have the real world around us, but if we look to maths or we look to science or, theoretical physics or quantum theory, it's like, oh, but we can actually truly see reality, or we can really see the universe or the cosmos if we do that. But again, the point I'm making is that it is a representation, and it's commonly referred to, or commonly compared with this story or fable by Borges, who was an Argentinian writer who he wrote these like amazing short stories. Like they're absolutely amazing. But one of them is basically about this country. It's like just a fictional country who basically try to make a map of their entire country, but it's the exact same size as the country. So the map tries to like fit over. It's like perfect scale, and they try to like basically fit an entire replication of the country in a map. And again, I think it's that sort of idea where, with our representations, we somehow are trying to replace the reality that we live in. But it's, you can't do that. It's not the same thing. Like data is not the same thing as reality. And we forget that it's the data that fits in our reality. It's the computers that are sitting in the world, in societies with real people who are suffering, and real people who we all want to have better lives. And again, it struggles because fundamentally we are unpredictable, and we're ambiguous as humans because we're defined by our relationships with other people, with our own bodies, with the unconscious processes. Why do we suddenly get angry? Why do we repeat the same destructive behaviors over and over again? Why, despite knowing about climate change, are we still not doing anything? All of these things, like we're not rational, and we're not rational because, reason is only one part of who we are. It doesn't completely define us. We're also human beings that live in the world. And fundamentally, the argument that I'm making here is that ethics, responsibility, and care come from us being human. They come from us being inconsistent, being imperfect, and being part of networks of relationships with other people, with families, with friends, with countries, nations, that we have bodies, and this is something that is referenced in the literature, where a certain discipline of neuroscience and cognitive science, moves away from that idea that the computer is a good metaphor for the brain. That actually, the brain, the nervous system, the culture, the societies that we live in are just like they have too many inputs into what consciousness is or what the mind is, for us to just say that it's just this machine that's working in the head, processing things. And then the extension of this is that care, can't be reduced just to data exactly because it's embodied and relational, and it requires us to be reflective and to think about things in light of new experiences, to be creative, to use those emotions, to be creative, to be imaginative, and to be responsible, and to think about what's right and wrong. And the idea that, what Abeba Barhan calls techno-optimism, this idea that, no, but we can, if we just get enough data, or if we just get the algorithm right, or if we just get the processes right, we really can, fix the world's problems, that they can be automated and quantified. Like, they point out that this actually causes huge problems because in the end, like, as you all know, like machine learning is infinitely more quicker and more powerful than, like a human doing the same tasks. And it can just, hugely amplify the prejudices which are already there in society. And there's a list, I'm sure you know them all already because they're always in the news and they're always like shared on social media and stuff. basically biases, and that unintentional biases are constantly amplified and reproduced, but at like really alarming rates and in ways that really affect and harm people. And also that the devices that are developed and the processes that are developed are not really in people's interests, as in the public, but in service of investors, engineers, designers, who tend to conventionally be white and male. So again, it comes back to the idea of diversity and representing the diversity. So I took this quote here because I really like this, from the same essay by Burhan and Van Dyke. And she says that once we see robots as mediators of human being, so human being, this thing that I've been talking about, we can understand this idea of robot rights debate as being focused on first world problems. So the idea that what about the rights of AI? What about the rights of artificially intelligent humans? They're kind of going against this point, saying that there's already a huge amount of injustice in the world at the moment, because there are these issues of machine bias, machine elicited human labor exploitation, and the erosion of privacy, which are all happening at the moment and tend to disproportionately affect the least privileged. And they conclude that if human being, so like coming back to the world, coming back to the fact that AI, machine learning, or whatever you want to call it, is happening within the world, where there's real people that that scientists are sharing the planet with. If we come back to that idea, and human welfare becomes the primary concern, then the negative impacts emerging from machining systems, as well as the lack of taking responsibility from people designing them and selling them and so on, remains the most pressing ethical discussion in AI. So they argue that AI cannot be disentangled from the ethics. Ethics isn't something you just tack on afterwards or add on afterwards. It's part and parcel of the decisions that are made in the very beginning, in how we decide what AI is. So literally on the last two slides here. So what does that look like in artificial intelligence? Well, this scholar here, Ruham Benjamin, says that we should change how we think about AI. That we should think about developing a justice-oriented AI. That ideas of optimization or what we think is optimal should follow justice and care and these things, which are, it becomes a tool again. So it's about being a tool for justice. She says we develop the value of justice by testing and observing the work that the justice hypothesis does. So that's what comes first in various situations. This is how you would implement it. And we recognize situations as just or unjust through reference to this learning. So learning isn't about just being able to do tasks. Learning is about how is this impacting people's lives? That's a core part of the learning. It's about questioning which social groups are classified, categorized, capitalized on, so others are free to tinker, experiment, design, and engineer the future. So again, it becomes a tool as opposed to it becoming the world, and we understanding the world through artificial intelligence, or mathematical reasoning, or data, or information, whatever these different paradigms are. Justice and fairness and equity and improving people's lives becomes the core focus here. And just this is an example of people who are working in the field of AI, who are thinking about these issues and are trying to put justice first. And the Just Data Lab is a really good, there's Black in AI as well. And they've got a website here which is full of resources looking at how issues of social justice can be tackled by using AI. And here's just like a collection. They have a page of resources. So they have like the Algorithmic Justice League, which aims to highlight algorithmic bias through media, art, and science. They have the Center for Media Justice, aims to build a powerful movement for more just and participatory media and digital world with racial equity and human rights for all. There's Data for Black Lives, a group of various multidisciplinary organizers aim to use data to create concrete and measurable change in the lives of Black people. So this is just, a selection of the kind of things and the kind of ways that people are thinking about care and thinking about how our monsters or our robots or our artificial intelligence or whatever the technology is that we're producing can be put to the benefit of humans, and recognizing that they're happening within the world, that we don't fall for that trick that we feel that we know everything, and that the world is a code that we're just trying to crack. So there, as my voice cracks from talking at you for the last 45 minutes, that's the end of my presentation. And I will. Thanks everyone for listening. I'm glad to see some of the people that were here at the start are still here. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to shout or to ask me.